All right, welcome to this edition of our Narrative Medicine Grand Rounds. My name is Allison Coffelt, and I will be your host this evening. On behalf of the Division of Narrative Medicine at Columbia University Irving Medical Center, I welcome those of you who are joining rounds for the first time, and welcome back all returning attendees. Narrative medicine arose at Columbia in 2001 and is now an international movement at the intersection of humanities, arts, clinical practice, and healthcare justice. Narrative training equips clinicians to humbly try to comprehend their patients' experiences and perspectives so as to deliver equitable and effective healthcare. Rigorous training and practice of narrative medicine helps all those interested in person-centered, respectful healthcare to deepen their self-awareness, clinical attunement, collaborative skills, and creative capacities. Our commitments to healthcare justice underlie our writing, our teaching, our research advocacy, and our delivery of care. The narrative medicine community assembles monthly at rounds to grow our knowledge, partnership, and commitment to a just and effective healthcare future. And to that end, we want to acknowledge the recent protests on the Columbia campus, as well as student action across the country. We know that members of our narrative medicine community have been deeply impacted by these events. One contribution we can make is to continue hosting what we believe are essential, vibrant, justice-forward conversations with speakers who help us re-examine and reimagine our world. Additionally, we are including information with resources in our closing slides. In times like these in particular, we are reminded daily of the messy, difficult work of pushing forward not only a more just system of healthcare, but a more just and peaceful society. So before we introduce our speaker for tonight, which I'm really looking forward to doing, I've been asked to mention a few basic Zoom ground rules to ensure our program runs smoothly. First, please keep your microphone muted to cut down on background noise during our program. Be forewarned that if there are any disruptions or inappropriate comments in the chat, you may be removed from the event. During the talk, we ask people to keep chat interactions to a minimum. I feel like I'm a flight attendant a little bit. I got that tone just a little bit. During our talk, we ask people to keep chat interactions to a minimum. As we get closer to the Q&A part of the event, you will have a chance to submit questions via the chat, and we will use the chat function for questions. But before then, we won't be able to monitor the questions. So please save your questions and type them into the chat when we get there. And I'll make an announcement about that during the presentation. Third, this event is being recorded. Everyone who registered will get the link to it in a day or two, and you can share it however you wish. Captioning is also available for tonight. Lastly, we'll have a link to the online bookstores to order books or find more information about our speaker and about the Department of Medical Humanities and Ethics and the program in narrative medicine. So it's my delight to introduce our speaker tonight, Andrew Leland. We are joined by Andrew, who's the author of the recent book, The Country of the Blind, a memoir at the end of sight. Named one of the best books of the year by The New Yorker, The Washington Post, The Atlantic, NPR, and others, Leland's memoir is a witty, winning, and revelatory personal narrative of the author's transition from sightedness to blindness and his quest to learn about blindness as a rich culture all its own. Andrew Leland's writing has appeared in the New York Times Magazine, The New Yorker, McSweeney's Quarterly, the San Francisco Chronicle, and Art in America, among other outlets. From 2013 to 2019, he hosted and produced The Organist, an arts and culture podcast for KCRW. He has also produced pieces for Radiolab and 99% Invisible. He has been an editor at The Believer since 2003, and he lives in Western Massachusetts with his wife and son. Again, my name is Allison Coffelt, and I'll add that I had the good fortune of meeting Andrew during the time he spent living in Columbia, Missouri. In addition to his impressive achievements, which you just heard about, Andrew is a generous reader, a keen editor, and a compassionate teacher. And it's really wonderful to have him here today. Welcome, Andrew.
Thanks, Allison. And thanks, everyone, for having me. So I think the way that we want to do this is I'm going to hold forth for about basically until 6:25 to 6:35, somewhere in that range, and then we'll have a conversation. And my aim is to hold forth on the shorter end of that, because I find that I don't know. The book is out there, and it's more fun to be in dialogue, I think, and more interesting. So I'll do that. But before I do, I did just want to add to the acknowledgement that you made, Allison, to the protests that are happening and that have just been shut down by Columbia on campus, and just say briefly that it felt impossible not for me to say something at the beginning, happening as this is on May 1st, 2024, the day after the building on campus there was cleared, and just to express my solidarity with the students at Columbia and at campuses across the country, as well as faculty who have been nonviolently protesting, and express my dismay at Columbia's administration's reaction to call on the use of police force to dismantle nonviolent protest in the name of solidarity with the people in Gaza, and to direct attention towards the war there and the genocide that's happening there. Not something I normally would ever say in a conversation about my book that is not about any of that, but considering the venue here at a virtual Columbia University event on May 1st, 2024, I felt like I had to, and I did. So there we have it. Now, somehow, I will segue into my book, which is called The Country of the Blind. And before I read a little bit from it, I will say a little bit about what it is and why I wrote it, as a way of just a way into the conversation that I hope to have tonight. So the book is a memoir of my experience of diagnosis and then gradual retinal degeneration over the course of decades. I was diagnosed with retinitis pigmentosa, or RP, as a teenager, when I first noticed that I had severe night blindness, and then gradually over the years, as my prognosis, my doctor suggested, I would have narrowing tunnel vision, and then in sometime in middle age, I would become blind, and that has sort of been true. And yet it was very easy to compartmentalize blindness, or the prospect of blindness, in my life. Even as I went through these milestones of retiring surrendering my driver's license, or giving away my bike, as gradually it became clear that those activities, driving and biking, were not safe for me anymore. But I still just felt like a sighted person, and I still read print unmagnified, unaccommodated, no assistive technology needed. And about 8 years ago, my partner Lily is an academic, and she got a job here in Western Mass, and I had owned a cane and carried it kind of folded up a lot and not using it unless it was a real situation that I really needed it. And I decided that I was at the point where I really needed to use it more, and this was like an opportunity to just force myself out of the closet, as it were. And so I just became a full-time cane user in public when we moved here in about 2016. And my vision changes at a very slow rate. Most people with RP only go to the retinal specialist every other year, because there's kind of no point, unless there's, and there often is, related and treatable eye conditions that come with it. RP is largely untreatable. And so my vision didn't radically change, but my experience of my vision impairment changed overnight, because of the use of the white cane. I became a different person in public and in private. And that experience was confounding and troubling, but also stirred up a lot of curiosity. And so I started taking kind of more serious notes about it. And then the other thing that happened around that time was as I started to write about it, I found that the experience connected to things beyond the personal very, very quickly and very naturally. So like thinking about this idea of the imposter that I still feel, but like to be somebody in public with a white cane, people often see the white cane as a marker, and people see blindness as a binary, right? Like, oh, blind guy can't see anything, needs me to grab his elbow. And just as an asterisk, no, he doesn't. Like, don't just grab blind people. I say that, that's like the one public service announcement that I have. There'll probably be more, but I just have to also say it's weird to be talking to an image of myself, and there's like I'm assuming that there's people here, but this could be one of the things where you're just like on the phone with a friend, and then you're talking for like 10 minutes, and then you realize oh, good, you're still here. Very good, thank you. Appreciate that. Anyway, so what was I saying? Right, it connects to the experience. Quickly felt more capacious, more interconnected with all these other ideas. So yeah, I was talking about the imposter syndrome. I felt like being somebody with a white cane who I felt that most people were looking and seeing as a totally blind person, and then looking at my phone or reading, seeing that the light had changed, and feeling the self-consciousness, and then realizing that that's actually an experience that a lot of disabled people have, and that there's like a really complicated history of people doubting disability, whether it's about like people sort of being leeches on the social services that society offers, and the sort of need to police disability. I found this group of people, they're Stevie Wonder truthers, who are convinced utterly, like in this sort of internet conspiracy theory, that Stevie Wonder is in fact sighted, and they have this like super spurious evidence for that, like any conspiracy theorist. And so I ended up writing an essay kind of connecting those dots a little bit, and basically started publishing essays that were taking my own experience of gradual vision loss and connecting them to these sort of bigger historical or cultural ideas, and it felt very, very generative to me, and it kind of was like a snowball effect where I just like, the more I wrote about it, the more I became curious about different aspects. And so the book emerged from that period of like the cane being a real lightning rod, sort of like, awoke the Frankenstein monster. And then, the way it's structured is, there is a narrative to it, sort of. But I don't know, arguably, we'll see if Allison thinks there is or not. But each chapter tries to take that approach of taking my own experience, and in some cases using that to like contextualize like historical stuff. In some cases it's sort of like a motivation to go into history or reporting. There's a lot of sort of present tense journalism where I go out into the world of the blind or disability, and try to meet people and understand what's happening now. And so that's sort of the methodology of the book. And each chapter takes a different theme or a different like core idea. So there's a chapter about blindness and gender and sexuality, and sort of thinking about my own role as a father and a husband, and looks at how blindness has sort of been desexualized or hypersexualized in some cases. And there's a chapter about technology and blindness, and it's really interesting ideas around interesting ideas that I encountered around the sort of relationship between innovation and disability and technology. There's sort of a chapter that engages with identity politics, and thinking about the sort of tension between the civil rights model of disability activism, where that very much focuses on a single characteristic, like the blind, right? There's like the National Federation of the Blind, and they make this argument that like the fact that you're blind is the most important thing, or historically they have made that argument. And that's obviously the rallying call. And then there's the disability justice movement that is very much in opposition to the civil rights model, and they're very intersectionally minded. And are focused on thinking about the ways that race and class and gender, and so on, these other marginalized identities can intersect with disability, and really try to poke at or dismantle or, push against the grain of the sort of like classic image of a disabled person, or even a disabled activist. I think historically, if you look at that person, or if you imagine that person, it tends to be, as Leah Lakshmi Peepsna Samarasinha, who's one of the most brilliant disability justice thinkers out there. I think she describes it as like a white cisgendered guy in a wheelchair. And I don't think she said this, but I was imagining as being like a mustache, and he's kind of like super, got nice biceps, and like obviously disability and sort of the experience of marginalization is way more complicated than that. So that's all to say that that's sort of the scope and the method of the book. And before I eat up all my time to read any of it, I'll just read a little bit from chapter 3, which is called Blinded by Definition. And it's about, I think, and I chose it, there's sort of two of like, I felt very resistant to writing about medicine at all, actually, and we can psychologize me later if you want, but my editor really had to push me to write a later chapter called Against Blindness that goes into like treatments and talk about optogenetics. And there was an article in the Washington Post last week that, as you can imagine, 70% of my family emailed to me against their better judgment, that covered a lot of the same material that I would have found about optogenetic research and stem cell therapies. So I talk about that, but also in that chapter I talk a lot about that exact resistance to cure that we can discuss later if you want. But this chapter, Blinded by Definition, is a lot more about me getting not diagnosed, but what's the word, like inducted into this club of the legally blind, and the kind of tension between identity, like the sort of medical definition of disability, and this sort of more inward originating sense of who I am as a blind person. And I should say, by conclusion of this rambling, but super enjoyable to listen to, sort of pressy of the book, that oh man, all of my little I just totally derailed my own mind. But yeah, forget it. Can we just end now? Is that okay? I think we're out of time. Just kidding. Let's just keep going. All right, I'm just joking.
Let's
what was I saying when I tried? It was all when I tried to decide how to say the word pressy that my mind just wiped blank. And when I said super enjoyable as a joke, that was bad too. Let's see.
Mass ear and eye?
Yeah, mass eye and ear. Whatever. I'm just going to start reading. That's the beauty of reading, is I'm not smart now, but I was so smart when I edited this. Damn, I gotta stop with the jokey self-aggrandizing, because most of the people here think I'm being serious.
They're all laughing. It's just
they're
laughing. It's just that they're on mute. Yeah, right. They're on mute.
Are they doing like the ASL laughter? That would be great. All right. Chapter 3, Blinded by Definition. My first visit to Mass Eye and Ear, MEE, started like any garden variety optometrist's appointment, with the eye chart. Using my good central vision, I could still see the big E at the top, and with glasses and proper lighting, I could read several of the smaller lines beneath it. I put some feeling into it. BAC, I said to myself, to the nurse, to the audience listening at home. In keeping with the vague idea I'd developed of producing a podcast about going blind, I'd brought along my tape recorder. OD, LK, QMBT, OP. As I made my way farther down the rows, the letters began folding themselves into vibrating, illegible, star-like clusters of silver pixels. I start to sound a little more desperate on the recording. K, T, L, Z, K, O, D, O, Z, R, K. I wish the nurse could just scan my eyes with a Star Trek tricorder and learn everything she needed to know. But vision is a powerfully subjective substance, one that is still most accurately measured by the patient's own report. Doctors appraise all the senses this way, with odd quizzes designed to standardize an elusive, highly interpretable impression. Patients indicate pain level as a point along an affective spectrum, from a happy face to one with a grimace, eyes squeezed shut and skin red with agony. Audiologists pipe a sonic version of the eye chart into our ears, benign nouns like dog and child that the auditor must repeat back. Raised in a culture that worships the authority of doctors, I find it difficult to trust entirely in my own report. Reading the chart and answering their questions, I felt like an unreliable narrator of what should be indisputable, my own direct observations. The tools that doctors use to measure vision are recent inventions. In 1836, Heinrich Kückler, a German ophthalmologist frustrated by the lack of consistency in eye examinations, cut out a selection of pictures from calendars, books, and newspapers, collaging and arranging those images, farm equipment, military weapons, and animals. He chose camels, frogs, and birds in descending order of size, just like the alphabetic eye chart I was reading. Pulled together from such disparate sources, Kukler's frogs and cannons all appeared in different styles, print qualities, and line weights. They also depended on the patient's ability to identify an eclectic range of industrial and zoological specimens. The collaged eye chart failed to catch on. And since there's no footnotes here, but I'm talking to you, I'll just say a shout out to Mara Mills, who's a professor at NYU, who gave a talk where I learned a lot of that history of the eye chart. A few years later, Kukler tried again, this time making a chart with letters. He chose a black letter typeface, like the New York Times's logo type, but even busier, denser, and narrower, and printed full words on the chart. Patients were able to guess the lines based on the context of the most legible letters, and the black letter typefaces used by different printers led to wide variations in size and inconsistencies in the measurements of patients' visual acuity. All of these problems were solved 20 years later by the Dutch ophthalmologist Herman Snellen, who created the eye chart more or less as we know it today. Lines of descending random letters printed in optotype, the font Snellen designed to regularize the weight, size, and shape of the letters, no matter what press they were printed on. Eventually, producers of the Snellen chart had to print variations on the letter arrangements since the chart had become so ubiquitous, including on coffee mugs, shower curtains, and throw rugs, that some patients had memorized the first few lines, like the lyrics to a popular song. We have some more time. Let's just keep going. There are 3 little dots indicating a new section, which, if I was an audio producer, I would replace with this sound. Bong! Mass Eye and Ear is 100 miles from my house, so I'd spent the night before my appointment in a hotel at the edge of the hospital complex in the Beacon Hill neighborhood. I wandered across the frozen medical campus, blearily scanning each facade for signs of the eye infirmary. I decided to stop at a Starbucks, and as I stood in line, I suddenly felt firm hands on my shoulders, steering me aside. A stranger, thinking himself helpful, had just moved me out of the way of a woman I hadn't seen, who I never really did see beyond a patchy peripheral feminine blur, who was apparently trying to get past. Strangers, I'm learning, frequently touch and guide blind people like this in public, without warning or consent, feeling the need to manage us like furniture or animals or toddlers. This was my first such encounter, and I was too surprised to say anything. I had another one 2 days ago. Just throwing that in there for you as a little bonus item. I found inherited retinal disorders on the 3rd floor of Mass Eye and Ear. As the doors of the talking elevator shut behind me, I walked past a vitrine displaying relics from the institution's history. MEE is the 2nd oldest eye hospital in the country, a fortress of philanthropic medicine, originally designed to treat the deserving poor, which meant mostly Irish laborers blinded by cataracts or industrial accidents. I stopped in front of a series of 6 oil portraits of eminent Massachusetts ophthalmologists. Oh, Gesundheit. I think. I stopped in front of a series of 6 oil portraits of eminent Massachusetts ophthalmologists and snapped a few photos on my phone. Instagram fodder in the form of this weird visual celebration of the mild-mannered men who had devoted their lives to the preservation and extension of vision. In the waiting room, I held my pile of recording equipment sheepishly in my lap, too shy to ask anyone if it was all right to use it. I listened, wishing I was recording, as the husband of a woman off somewhere having her eyes dilated talked about how she had kept driving long after her deteriorating vision should have stopped her. One day she rear-ended a dump truck, which was so much higher than her car that she managed to actually wedge her car beneath it. Midway through this harrowing story, his wife returned from the examination room and cheerfully delivered the kicker. I was almost decapitated. If anyone had been in the passenger seat, they would have been. Her husband confessed that for years he'd encouraged her to limit herself to driving to and from work. It was such a short drive, he said. What could be the harm? She was diagnosed with RP at 70 years old. Brian Bashan, who runs the Lighthouse for the Blind in San Francisco, told me that RP is the most potent denial machine. Because people with RP hang on to the ability to see something throughout our degeneration, down to the last photon, there's a powerful incentive to think, well, I can still see. I can't actually be blind just yet. And I don't know, I think it's fun to throw in these little comments, and you're silent, so you can't stop me. Amazingly, I don't think I'll name him. I don't know if he wants to be named, but I've made a friend since this book came out who reached out to me who has RP, and his mom has RP, and he was reading it, and he was like, with that scene with the man and the woman almost would have been decapitated. He was like, I think that's my mom, like, because they go to ME, and it turns out it was. And also I got that wrong. She wasn't diagnosed at 70. She was diagnosed at 50, I think. There you go. I'll keep reading for 4 more minutes or 6 more minutes. After the eye chart, the next step was the visual field test. I dreaded this one even more than the way they pried my eyelids open, Clockwork Orange style, for the electroretinogram that was coming later. I sat in a rolling office chair, and the nurse asked me to press right up into what amounted to an awkward embrace of the squat metal machine, which hummed with electrical current. Then I peered through a scope on the side, which offered a view into a tiny amphitheater with a dull yellow light shining in its center. The nurse handed me a game show style buzzer, which she told me to press whenever I saw a pinprick of wobbly light moving from the periphery of the amphitheater toward the light in its center. For most people, this test is as routine as the eye chart, a little medical carnival game. But as I waited to see the wobbly lights emerge from my dead periphery, impotently clutching the buzzer through the long silence, certain that the light would have been visible to someone with a normal visual field many minutes ago, my anxiety grew. Finally, a light appeared directly in front of me, and I gave the buzzer a squeeze, the worst contestant in the history of Jeopardy! As soon as we finished the visual field exam, the nurse informed me in her terminal deadpan that she'd now give me the double eye patch. It took me a moment to understand her meaning. Wasn't a double eye patch just a blindfold? I think of eye patches in the same category as monocles. They are only ever singular. It's like calling a bicycle a double unicycle. But blindfold, with its daredevil associations, would be out of place in the eye hospital. It would introduce that word, which must only be whispered, blind, carrying like an infectious disease vector the same unpleasantness my cane brought into the waiting room. In my chart, I have scotomas, not blind spots. An eye patch is medical, something a child might have to wear for a few months. Lily, my wife, wore one for a year when she was 5, tripling the cuteness of her childhood photos. But a blindfold is for parlor games, something a ringmaster puts on before he shoots an apple off someone's head, or what they have you wear before you face the firing squad yourself. Before I'd had a chance to fully think through the semiotics, the nurse asked me to remove my glasses. She placed a piece of gauze over one eye and secured it in place with tape. There was a brief pause, as at the peak of a roller coaster's ascent. Then she performed the same operation on the other eye, and just like that, I really was blind, and there's no other word for it. Hey, Allison, don't you think we should stop there and then have the conversation?
Yeah, that seems like a good stopping point.
Okay, yeah, because I don't think the next 3-dot period is not for a little while here.
Thanks for reading that excerpt and for the context and of course the sound effect.
Yeah, my pleasure. Sorry that I briefly lost all bearing on reality, but I'm back.
It's good to have you.
Thanks.
I think one of the things I really like this excerpt because I think it's just so rich. There's so much we could talk about with it, but I want to start by thinking about the way that this excerpt does this, but so does the book in general. It really challenges your readers, and I think by virtue of you being challenged in this way, to not give into binaries. So in the book, you really push against binaries, like your life experience, as you describe. You're not fully blind yet, slash maybe never, slash maybe soon. And you're
Maybe already.
also right, and you're also not fully sighted. And as a discipline, narrative medicine is really interested and invested in interrogating binaries. One of the foundational binaries that we really interrogate is this idea of the mind versus the body, or the idea that we have to pick one over the other, and as if we can't both value an embodied experience and scientific inquiry, which of course we know that we can in fact value both at the same time. This was exemplified, I think, in that segment that you read when you said you felt like an unreliable narrator of something that should have been unquestionable, which is your experience, right? So we're interested in challenging this either or. And I guess I'm curious about where you are with your thinking about binaries now. Like, now that the book has come out, it's been a while since you had that encounter. You've had to live through so much more of this back and forth. How has your thinking on binaries shifted since you started writing the book? Where are you now with that?
I guess there's of two minds, which is appropriate for that question. I mean, on the one hand, I think of it, I mean, and this might be too much of like a hippie mindfulness answer, but like, I think I have this naive and hopeful sense writing the book that like I was doing this, making this tremendous intellectual effort and emotional effort, and that like having written it and then edited it and revised it and then published it, like my thinking was getting reified, and like the lesson would be there in like a form of this like pulp brick that I could like bludgeon things with, but or use to prop up delicate objects. But of course, like it doesn't work like that. And like while I do feel like writing the book moved me into a new place in my relationship with blindness and disability. It's like as Elvis Costello said, every day I write the book, and I feel that way very strongly. Like I still have to sort of wake up every day and like and do the work of pushing back against the kind of like essentializing, polarizing attitudes that come from outside but also come from inside. And so like an example of that might be still feeling that imposter syndrome that I'm talking about, where like even now, after all of these, fancy thoughts and conversations and, like revisions, I'm still kind of like, will ask Lily, like, in some ways it gets exacerbated by the book, because like now I'm Mr. Blindness, like, on TV holding forth about blindness or whatever. And I'm like, who am I? Like, I still can read that excerpt fluidly from my phone, and that's not a blind guy thing. I mean, so that's one part of it, is just to say it's like this ongoing process of wrestling with it, and it feels like probably that never ends to some degree. And that was one of the revelations of the book, I think. Like one of the things that I took away from it was that, like, talking to people who are on the same path that I am with RP, 30 or 40 years down the line, and they're still wrestling with it, even though from where I'm sitting, I'm like, you are capital B blind, and they're like, right, but I can still sort of see in one eye where the sidewalk ends and where there's no acuity, but they can like see black asphalt and white sidewalk. And like for me, that's you've crossed over at that point. And they're like, well, I don't know how like people who are totally blind deal with that. And I was like, oh, there's still that hierarchy of sight. And
Still
so,
some othering.
Yeah. And so when I heard that, I was kind of like, I don't want, I hate telling that story, which is in the book, and I tell a lot, because like the person who told it to me is wonderful. And I don't want to like hold them up as an object lesson or something. But I think just for me, like, that's one thing that I try to push back against in myself but I still do it. That kind of like, when will it happen? And like, what will it mean? And it'll be different or worse than it is now. And so I think more and more, the kind of like impossible but worthy thing to try to aim towards, that gets like more or less attainable, is to say, like my friend Will Butler, this is my friend Will Butler's advice that I relate in the book, where it's like, you might be more blind, you might be less blind, but you might be going blind for a really long time. At a certain point, you might just have to accept that you're blind and move on a little bit, and that might happen when I still, and I think his implication was, it ought to happen while I still have residual vision. And so I think that's the other answer to your question, is that I'm no longer as invested in how much residual vision I need to retain in order to think of myself as blind. And that's why I kind of interjected into your question to say, like, maybe already, because I use a white cane every day. My screen reader is on my computer all day. On my phone, I would say like 90% of the time. I read Braille every day. I hang out in blind discords and stuff. Like, what am I doing that's not blind? I mean, plenty, right? Like, I'm looking at stuff, but like, I'm kind of doing it. And part of that is from the outside, right? Like, I'm legally blind, like I've lost enough vision. The doctors agree, but also I think the more important metric is that internal one, where I'm like trying not to rely on my vision so much and try to do things in a blind way.
Yeah. I think you're also, I mean, it's like, that is a paradox or binary that you're pointing to too, of like, when you think about people who are, as you mentioned, have had RP longer than you, saying this sense of what is it mean to be blind has shifted for them, like their definition of blindness has, like maybe that idea, the example of the sidewalk, would maybe then 20 years ago would have considered not being able to see beyond the black asphalt and and where the sidewalk ends. Maybe they would have considered that blindness, and yet when they're there, that definition shifts. And so it's also this question about, why does that matter, and what does that do to us in our relationship with each other? And how does that shift the way that we think of ourselves in relationship to other? I'm glad you mentioned Will Butler, because this was beautiful pearl in the book, about how he says, you're not, he says, you have to stop saying you're going blind, but you're becoming blind.
Yeah.
Will you share that with the audience?
I mean, you just did it. I mean, that's it. Like, Will Butler, when I met him, was working for the San Francisco Lighthouse, which is a really fascinating and awesome place that offers different services to blind people in the Bay Area. Then he worked for Be My Eyes, which is a very interesting blindness tech startup. And now he's at Apple doing PR for their like accessibility stuff. And he's also a journalist. He's written for Vice and New York Times and stuff like that. But yeah, I mean, this is just like a conversation, and I first spent time with him at a National Federation of the Blind. My first time I went to a National Federation of the Blind national convention, which is 3,000 blind people in a hotel. The year I went, it was in Florida, in Orlando. So we were just, and that was my, I had only ever really like met maybe one or two blind people in person before. And suddenly it was like this immersion, and, 3,000 of any type of person, you're going to have a pretty wide range of diversity. I don't care what the category is. NFB is no exception. It's like, you've got blind Trumpers, you've got blind anarchists, you've got, little kids, parents. It's a whole spectrum. And Will was like a really wonderful guide to that world for me a little bit. And because the other thing is, like, because blindness, the only thing that those folks have in common is blindness in some ways. There is a finer grain to it. We can talk about like the character of the NFB. But blindness being a relatively low incidence disability, like in my town, when I went to like the blindness meetup, it was like mostly women in their 70s, which love women in their 70s. But like, if I'm looking for somebody who I can like feel like I'm relating to more than just like this experience, it was like, that there was a disconnect there. Whereas Will is like, we listen to the same music. We have a mutual friends in common who don't have anything to do with blindness. It was like, there was a much more feeling of cohesion. And that was so helpful to me, because it made, for the first time, blindness feel like just like another piece of my life, like not some medicalized tragedy, but like, oh, like this is a thing that like other people who I might be hanging out with anyway are dealing with in ways that speak to me. And so that idea that like becoming blind, this sounds like a deranged analogy, but like, I think we're so used to thinking about acquiring a disability in those terms of like tragedy, that was sort of a radical shift for me. It was like becoming a guitar player or something, or like becoming
yeah.
becoming a Texan after moving to Austin.
Yeah, it becoming that it plays this kind of forward motion,
Yeah,
instead of like going, you're leaving, because
exactly.
he's like an arrival. But
Yeah.
the I mean, it makes me think about, just a quick note, you mentioned in the book, how in many disabilities are like this, and even the word, disability you could spend a lot of time on, but the public narrative of blindness is like, oh, whenever you read a story in the news about someone who has RP, they suffer from, they
Yes.
suffer from RP. They,
Yes.
have somehow triumphed over their blindness to insert, XYZ physical or intellectual achievement.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things your book does really beautifully is it says, I'm really on the hunt for other kinds of stories.
Yeah.
And I'm interested in living and doing reportage, first person reportage. So I will say in just a minute, I'm going to ask you one more question, then I want to open it up. There's going to be an opportunity in just a minute to get to chat questions. So feel free to start thinking about what those might be for our audience. This is another a little bit of a big question, but I think that I think that you're well suited to answer it. I think there's so many points in this book that are, I think, beautiful in the way that you have these little mile markers of where you are, and physical condition of how that has shifted as you're writing the book. So for example, you write, I retired from print while writing this book, or between the first and the second draft of this book, I now keep my screen reader on all the time. And these, to me, they feel like these little mile markers, or little stops, along the way, like we're on this highway. And I really think that a lot of the book structure felt like we were on this wayfinding journey, into this landscape, or a country of the blind, if you will. So I'm curious about if that feeling of being on this journey, being on this, I thought I wrote it, I said it was like this catalog of wayfinding, if that was super conscious for you as you were writing, or if that kind of emerged, or maybe both. I don't know.
Thank you for that. I don't know. The first thing that comes to mind is I remember I was emailing with poet John Lee Clark, like kind of throughout. I wrote a story about him and some of his work while I was working on this book, and we were just sort of talking. He's deafblind and one of the great thinkers of our time. I think, like, put money on him getting a MacArthur. I think that you money, whatever the British places that let you put money on something like that. But I remember I asked him what he thought of the title, and he was like, "Oh no, it's good. Like, too many books about blindness, use a sort of visual pun." And like, whatever, no shade to them, that's John's throwing shade, but I'm not, but he was like, it's good that it's got this kind of like landscape feeling. And I really was grateful for that comment, like that it's sort of like, and then he's like Mr. Tactile, like he's just sort of like our poet laureate of the tactile. And I think that was a little bit of what he was getting at, was that it was sort of like, it's a spatial metaphor and not a visual one.
Yeah.
And and I write in the introduction too about an experience I had, when I was doing sleep shade training in Colorado. So like one of the later chapters of the book is about my time at the Colorado Center of the Blind in Littleton, where you wear vision occluding sleep shades for like 8 hours a day, 5 days a week. And as a way of learning wayfinding, just like you're saying. And to me, that really felt like a metaphor for the writing process, where you enter a room under sleep shades. You might have been there before, you might not, and you're just sort of encountering. And the first time you do it, especially when you're learning how to do what's called in the biz O&M, or orientation and mobility, it's like basically cane training. It's like your cane hits something and you're like, you might like, the beginner student, like, what did I hit? But you see the advanced students and they just walk in and they're just kind of like, dish, 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 like whacking stuff. And it's like, okay, corner here, door on the south side, and then I felt that transformation even like my first week there. It was like, I started out being like, hello, and very, very nervous. And then eventually I was like, okay, I know that like the whatever, the trash can is on my right every time. And writing is like that too. Like, you first enter and it's like, how am I ever going to read the like 700 books I need to read, or interview the 700 people? And then by the end of the process, you're kind of like, I know where all the big stuff is, and it's just a matter of kind of like, tidying up or whatever. So yeah, I think the wayfinding metaphor is actually really important to me.
Yeah, well, and it's a good parallel with writing, because sometimes I think of that as like, yeah, you're figuring out what furniture's like. I've used that, like you're in this dark room and you don't know what furniture it is, and then you like feel around until you figure out that it's the living room or whatever. And I've thought about that even, years ago before thinking about it in terms of sight ability. But
I mean, I think I got at this with what I just said, but I'll just add too, because like I'm working on a new like a magazine story right now, and today I was interviewing this guy, and I mean, it's something this is something that was definitely not conscious for me, but I think retrospectively, it's like I kind of like accidentally or intuitively got the like blind philosophy or the blind perspective, which is to say that like, and this is kind of getting back to John Lee Clark's point about not using like a visually oriented title, is that, I think like the hip way, hip is the wrong word, but like, you hear people talk about non-visual things. Like I took a non-visual data science workshop with a blind data scientist, or like this guy was talking about non-visual virtual reality stuff. And that idea of like something being non-visual is really important, because so much is like, as my friend Leona Godin says, she wrote a really great book called Their Plant Eyes. That's like a personal and cultural history of blindness that came out a couple of years ago. She points to ocular centricism, right? Like so much in our society is fixated on the visual, and the visual being at like the top of the senses. And I think if you think spatially, if you think about things in that way of like, space doesn't have to be visual, right? Space can be tactile, space can be auditory. And I think like the metaphor of the country of the blind, or that feeling about wayfinding, it's non-visual. It's not anti-visual. It's just, instead of trying to translate the visual world, it's finding that you can inhabit the world in a different way, in a non-visual way that is sort of, it kind of, it's like a parallel structure rather than a antagonized or like a, hierarchical structure.
Yeah. Well, and I like that, I think that's it's an important point around like the hierarchy of the senses. And when we think about the metaphor of seeing as knowledge, I see, or like whatever, I see what you mean.
Yeah.
I want to just make a quick note that the Country of the Blind, as Marina Vladova mentioned in the chat, is indeed a H.G. Wells story as well, which you talk about in the book. So one question that is in the chat that is from A.K. Anderson. It's I think it's going to help us. It's going to bring us a little bit back to thinking about challenges within the medicalized knowledge system. She says, since you mentioned this earlier, what are your thoughts about medical treatments as those detailed in the Washington Post article? So I think this question also has to do with like when your family members people send you these articles about cures, or people are like, oh, but is there, what's the newest in gene therapy or whatever? Which I think is actually a little bit related to people moving you physically.
Interesting. Yeah.
But we can talk about that later. But yeah, will you speak to AK's question about the Washington Post article? Yeah.
Yeah. There is a really fascinating world, by whatever you want to call it, like a sub community. There's a strand running through disability of resistance to cure that can take a lot of different forms. I think like one of the more dramatic ones that people like to point out is, deaf folks who, look at cochlear implants as, a sort of like cultural imperialism as a way of like eradicating ASLs, as a language community. Like the shock that some people who haven't thought about it before feel when they hear that like deaf people intentionally procreate to have deaf children, like, as a sort of like a cultural practice almost, right? Like to extend that culture. And in the same way that like other cultures or identities intermarry to pass it forward. And I don't feel like that necessarily, like that level of antagonism towards like research into blindness. Like, I'm more power to them is my feeling. And I've heard that from a lot of blind people. It's like, it's not like, and I think there's a difference. One of the differences between blindness and deafness in that way is that it's not a language community in the same way that like a signing community is. And so therefore, like there is culturally blind stuff, but it doesn't feel as like nationalistic, I guess, in a way, like the way that my very glancing experience with deaf communities feel. So I don't have like that kind of intense antagonism necessarily towards cure, but also I think, and I think you were kind of pointing to this, Allison, it's like the kind of assumption that I'm going to be interested in it feels antagonistic to me. Like, and I think the most succinct way I can say it is that, if my doctor told me, hey, the FDA just approved this thing that if you take it will preserve/improve your vision, like, great, I'll take it. But for me to get invested in clinical trials or like the micro updates of the optogenetic breakthroughs feels like a waste of my energy. And my energy goes towards improving my Braille reading speed, improving my facility with screen readers, improving my cane skills, building community with blind people. Because like the smart money says, maybe you got information I don't, but like, I know blind people in their 70s who have been told by their doctors for 60 years that there's a breakthrough just around the corner. And guess what? They are going to die blind. And then that's okay. I'm okay with that. And I don't want to be like a grouchy 70-year-old who's like shaking my fist at like the medicine's failure to cure me. I'd much rather be a 70-year-old like reading an elderly Zadie Smith's latest novel, happily on the beach with a pina colada.
In Braille.
In Braille or audio.
Yeah, it'll be a large
or
book. I was just
multimodally,
picturing.
doing both.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I think it does speak to you mentioned the Samuel Beckett play at the end of the book, and you talk about the pain of ambiguity. And I think in some ways this like focus, if it could become that, a focus of holding out for some kind of miraculous cure, could just, like you're saying, it could distract. Yeah, I suppose I'm just reiterating what you said, but you'd rather spend your energies elsewhere. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to mention that we've had a number of comments from the chat of just thanking you. And so I'd like to read a few of them because we are here out of time in a moment. And I just want to share a few of them. Ying Wang says, thank you so much for showing that physical limitations of, quote, blindness can make you a visionary. And I also, we also had a comment from someone who works in palliative care who says that she embraces Karina Altman. I embrace the narrative as I work in palliative care and embrace narrative as a core component of the gift of my work. I so appreciate you speaking to the continuum of blindness, ableism, and continuing to connect with your own identity physically and psychosocially. So those are just a few of the thank yous that are coming through in the chat. And I wanted to make sure you caught those. Awesome. Unfortunately, we are out of time. So I'm going to share a little bit of information about how you can get this conversation or share this conversation. But Andrew, thank you so much for being here and sharing your work and sharing a snippet into your life. And I just want to highly recommend this book. It's such a compelling read. I love the way that you mix in, I think we heard this in the excerpt you read, but I love the mixture of first person reporting, history, political history, cultural history, activist history, reflection. It's a really gorgeous mosaic that you've compiled.
Thanks, Allison. I really appreciate it. And thanks for coordinating this event, which was really, really lovely.
Thanks. So thank you all for joining us tonight. Tonight's event, the recording of it will be shared later this week via email to all who registered. This round's event, it concludes our 23-24 season of Narrative Medicine Rounds. We hope you enjoy your summer break, and we'll see you again in September when we start with 24-25 Narrative Medicine Rounds. There's a slide right here that shows where you can get Andrew's book, as well as the resources that we mentioned at the beginning of our talk.
I feel obligated to do the thing where a slide gets described for anybody who might be blind or just not have their screen on. It says Columbia Narrative Medicine with a little Columbia logo. Oh, it just changed. There's a picture of my book and it said places you could buy it. And then there was like a YouTube link. And now we got a bunch of Columbia resources. I'm not going to be able to read all this. Public safety, 212-854-2797.
Thank you.
Just, yeah. There's a picture of me looking pretty happy.
Your headshot.
My headshot, narrativemedicine.org.
And
the worst
it says
audio
this
description
will,
ever.
this will be on the Narrative Medicine YouTube channel.
It says, thank you again for joining us for May 2024 Narrative Medicine Rounds with Andrew Leland.